exposure metrics and latency, a formal assessment of the consistency and study-specific results, and more comprehensive and statistically stable estimates. This could bring some clarity to the current state of the science. In another noteworthy study, Danish investigators followed up cell phone subscribers over time and found no increased risk of brain tumors among the subscribers. This type of study, called a prospective study, has the advantage of not having to rely on people's ability to remember their past cell phone use, which could be inaccurate or biased. We do know that cell phone use is increasing rapidly among children and adolescents. They are a potentially sensitive group because of their small head size and could result in higher radio frequency exposure, and the young brain may be more sensitive. To date, there are no published studies in the peer-reviewed literature regarding the risk of cancer and cell phone use in children. However, there are ongoing studies in Europe that will soon provide information on the risk from cell phone use among children. In summary, then, thus far, brain cancer incidence trends in the U.S. are unrelated to patterns of cell phone use. Most analytic studies indicate no overall increased risk of brain tumors within the first 10 years. There are inconsistent findings of increased risk across many different ways of measuring increased dose. There are some isolated findings of increased risk in some dose and population subgroups, but larger studies and replication in different study designs are needed to sort out the roles of chance and bias from those findings that are really worth pursuing. Potential risks associated with childhood exposure have not been assessed. Insight into these last 2 points may come relatively soon from ongoing analyses of the overall interphone study and from the Northern European case control study of childhood cancer. I thank you for the opportunity to present. Look forward to your questions.
I thank you, Dr. Hoover. I want to thank each of the witnesses. We're going to go to questions from members. I would like to begin by asking the scientists who are here. I believe every one of you agrees that the science is not conclusive on a connection between cell phones and human health effects. Nevertheless, some scientists look at inconclusive data and see something of concern, while others look at that same data and conclude there's no connection. For the layperson, can you scientists please explain how's that possible? Dr. Carpenter, you want to start?
Well, I wear both hats. I'm also a laboratory scientist, and the tradition in laboratory science is that one keeps doing experiments until you get results that show a consistency where there's no greater than a 5% chance that your result could be due to statistical variability. As a public health official, I look at this issue quite differently, because I agree that I don't think that the overall evidence for brain cancer from using cell phones reaches quite that 95% confidence limit. But as a public health official, are we at the same place we were with smoking and lung cancer 30 years ago? In fact, as Dr. Davis in a recent book demonstrated very clearly, the Nazis in the 30s had definitive evidence for a relationship between smoking and lung cancer. We in the U.S. ignored that evidence and did nothing until the Surgeon General's report in, the late 70s? And I see this from the public health perspective as being very, very important that we urgently need more research. I totally agree with Dr. Hoover. I think this interphone study has some potential, but there's some problems with that as well. We have almost no U.S.-funded research in this area.
Dr. Herberman, would you care to respond?
Yes, thank you. I think there are several issues that I'd like to bring up. One is, although there have been a number of different studies, I point out that the large majority of the negative studies are actually not independent of each other, but have used the same methods.
What does that mean?
Well, particularly about 6 different countries that participated in the interphone study used exactly the same design. So if there are flaws in the design, these would be replicated across each of those studies. One of those, which is often cited, the Danish Cancer Society study, and Dr. Hoover referred to that, used a very large number of people, but it excluded all business users from the study. That study actually started with about 700,000 cell phone users, but excluded the 200,000 who were the business users, and most likely during that era the most heavy users of cell phones. They also defined a user as someone who made a simple one call a week. That's not the type of exposure that I'm concerned about. They also didn't evaluate, in most of these studies, the use of cordless phones, which, as I said in my testimony, also involves radio frequency signals. Lastly, let me try to address some of the comments that Dr. Hoover just made. As he nicely summarized, most of the studies that look at the data mainly looked at exposures of less than 10 years. But as I said in my testimony, I believe it's most likely that the latent period before cancer would develop from such exposure would be probably more than 10 years. I also note that Dr. Hoover failed to discuss the studies by Dr. Leonard Hardell. And I noticed in the Cancer Bulletin that the NCI just published within the last few days that among their references, the Hardell studies were omitted. I think that this is a major lapse of turning a blind eye to the studies that concern me the most.
I want to thank Dr. Herberman. We're going to have a chance to get back to you and to Dr. Hoover, when I ask the next round of questions to the witnesses. But before my time is up, I want to ask Mrs. Marks if you have any response to what you've just heard. And I would just ask you to just keep it brief.
Well, my response would be that I'm not a scientist. I'm a human being, a mother, a wife. I do know from my research and from talking with doctors and scientists worldwide that there are major flaws, even in this interphone study. I have in front of me something right here that says, the interphone studies always find a statistical significant elevated risk when a cell phone has been used for 10 or more years on the same side of the head where the tumor was found. I'm sorry, but I'm not understanding the lack of correlation here.
Okay, you know what, I'm going to, in deference to Dr. Hoover, who may have a different opinion, I'll give you a brief response to what was said here.
Okay, you don't want me to respond to that
You can
rather than your
respond
question?
to your colleagues here.
Okay. Yeah, certainly Dr. Hardell's studies, Dr. Hardell has made important contributions, and he was one of the first in the field. As I mentioned in my statement, however, that as more studies have come out, there's the capability, and more diverse findings have emerged, there's a capability of segregating studies by quality. And I think to Dr. Hardell's credit, he attempted to do something very fast and yet an answer very quickly. He used a method of pursuing prevalent cases in his early studies that effectively ended up eliminating everybody who died quickly or had significant impairment. And in, I think his first study had about less than 30% of the total number of cases. So there have been over time studies to address those kinds of issues, and and also have more long-term users. So I certainly focused on mainly on those. We could have a discussion all day about.
Well, we're definitely going to go to more questions.
Right. So I think that the issue of the metric and the dose is that I think tobacco was mentioned a couple of times. With tobacco and with ionizing radiation, for example, there are associations with virtually any dose measure you use with dose rate, how many cigarettes per day, with total duration that you smoked, with total pack years, kind of with age that you started, with time since you stopped. Those are all, so with those kind of data, it makes it really easy to